It was a stormy night. Rain was pouring and the thunder was booming in the distance. Alyssa sat huddled in the corner of her couch, wrapped in a warm blanket, with a cup of hot tea and a thrilling novel. The flickering flames in the fireplace added to the serenity of the moment. She lived alone in a cozy little house in a quiet neighborhood, and the sound of rain against her windows helped create the soothing ambience. While enjoying her book in the tranquility of her home, a sudden knock on the front door shattered her calming environment. Startled by the knock at the door, Alyssa jumped to her feet, her heart beating profoundly. She stood still, her fingers frozen on the book's pages. She glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Who could be at her door at this hour, amid a thunderstorm? The knocking on her door began again, this time louder. Alyssa's instincts told her not to open the door and pretend she wasn't home. But her warm-hearted nature took over. She thought to herself, what if someone needed help? With hesitant steps, Alyssa tiptoed toward the door. The rain drummed against the roof, its relentless beat matching the pounding of her heart. She peered through the peephole, but the darkness outside obscured her vision. There was no way for her to see who stood on the other side.
Hello?
There was no response. Alyssa's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her mind filled with a mix of fear and concern. Slowly, she pulled the door open, revealing a dark figure. Raindrops poured from the stranger's hat, which was masking his features.
Can I help you?
The stranger lifted his head, revealing a pair of piercing eyes that seemed to bore into Alyssa's soul. His voice was soft, barely audible over the rain.
I'm sorry to disturb you, but my car broke down a few blocks away. I don't have a phone, and I was wondering if I could use yours to call for help.
Alyssa hesitated, her gaze shifting between the stranger and the storm raging outside. She felt a mix of sympathy and caution. Should she let this unknown person into her home? After a moment of deliberation, she made a decision.
Wait here.
She left the door slightly ajar as she hurried to fetch her phone. Returning to the entrance, Alyssa held her phone out to the stranger, careful to keep the door between them.
You can use it here, but I won't let you inside.
The stranger nodded, his expression unreadable. He reached out to take the phone with a pale hand. Alyssa watched him as he dialed a number, his eyes never leaving hers. Alyssa stood silently, attempting to listen to the conversation through the small opening in the door. The stranger spoke in deep whispers, as if trying to prevent her from hearing his words. Alyssa continued to hone in, and her heart began to race as she caught snippets of words. Alone. Easy prey. Fear gripped her, and she knew she had made a grave mistake by opening the door. The stranger had manipulated her, played on her compassion in an attempt to gain access into her home. Panic surged through her veins, urging her to retreat, to slam the door shut and lock it. But she knew that could lead to a possible fatal scenario. If this person harbored ill intentions, he would find a way inside, whether invited or not. Alyssa had to think fast to find a way to protect herself. The stranger ended the call and handed the phone back to Alyssa. Her mind now racing, Alyssa knew she needed to remain calm to prevent the stranger from knowing she heard any of the conversation. She smiled at the stranger, her voice somehow finding warmth.
I'm sorry about your car. Unfortunately, I can't let you in, but I'll call a tow truck for you.
The stranger's eyes narrowed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face.
I understand. Thank you for your help.
The stranger turned his back towards Alyssa and stood frozen. Seconds passed and the stranger eventually began slowly walking away from her house. As Alyssa closed and locked the door, Her mind raced with possibilities. She had to find a way to protect herself, and she needed to call for help. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, something to ward off any potential threat. The rain began pouring harder as the thunder crackled loudly. Alyssa watched the stranger through the door's peephole until he disappeared into the darkness. Alyssa turned as her heart pounded, her back now pressed against the door. The lights in her home began to flicker, and suddenly she was standing in darkness. The intensity of the storm severed the electricity in her home, leaving only the flickering flame in the fireplace. Panic consumed her. She frantically began fumbling at her cell phone with trembling hands, knowing there was an urgency to call for help. Her hands still shaking, Alyssa pressed the button to activate her screen, but nothing happened. Her phone screen remained dark. She began pushing the button frantically, pounding on the phone screen, but it remained unresponsive. Standing in the darkness of her living room, only illuminated by the fireplace's dying flames, fear took a hold of her body and her anxiety elevated. Alyssa's head and eyes began erratically moving in all directions, desperately searching for a solution, an escape from what awaits her in the darkness outside of her home. In a moment of desperation, Alyssa remembered the old landline phone in the corner of her basement. She never used the landline, but always kept it active in case of an emergency. Without hesitation, Alyssa raced to the basement through the darkness of her home. When she reached the area of the basement where the landline phone was located, she began desperately searching in the darkness with her hands to find its location on the wall. Finally, her hands grazed upon the phone, knocking it off the wall. Alyssa quickly retrieved the phone and dialed the emergency services number, her heart pounding as she hit each digit. The line crackled with static, but to her relief, a voice answered on the other end.
Emergency services. How can I assist you?
With panic in her voice, Alyssa whispered with fear,
Please, I need help. Now.
Alyssa's body trembled as she explained her distressing situation. She described the stranger at her doorstep, the unsettling conversation, and her fear for her safety. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way and asked her to remain inside, keeping the doors and windows locked until the authorities arrived. Alyssa remained on the phone with the operator as she peered through the blinds, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the police. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she listened to the storm outside, her anxiety refusing to subside, while the dispatcher attempted to keep her calm. Finally, the flashing lights of a police car sliced through the darkness, casting a beam of hope into Alyssa's heart. At the direction of the dispatcher, she ended the call and hurriedly opened the door. She welcomed the police officers into her home and recounted the events of the evening, providing a detailed description of the stranger and the unsettling conversation she had overheard. The officers listened intently, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. After taking her statement, the police assured Alyssa that they would do everything possible to apprehend the stranger. They recommended that she take precautionary measures to enhance her home security and stay vigilant in the coming days. The police began searching the outer perimeter of her home. In the woods, several feet from Alyssa's home, an abandoned vehicle was found. However, the stranger had disappeared into the night. On a search of the vehicle, the police officers found rope, duct tape, and a large machete in the trunk. The police officers returned to inform Alyssa of their discovery, and now urged her to stay with a trusted friend or family member until further notice. Alyssa quickly packed a bag with essentials and quickly left her home with the police by her side. It took several weeks before Alyssa was able to take short visits to her home to make sure everything was still in place. It took several months longer before she was able to stay at her home alone. The experience left an indelible mark on Alyssa's life. knowing she narrowly escaped a potentially fatal end. At the hands of the stranger in the storm,